March 9th, 1945. Tokyo's fire chief studied his maps and exhaled relief. High-altitude raids meant scattered hits, bombs drifting on the jet stream like leaves. The Americans would fly at 25,000 feet, again, same as always. At ground level, Yoshiko Hashimoto set a dented bucket by her door and checked the cloths for beating sparks. Her baby slept against her shoulder. The canal glinted at the end of her block. Water was safety. On Saipan, that same night, Bob Wallace, 20s, chapped knuckles, nervous pencil tapping, sat in a briefing room that smelled like coffee and exhaustion. The officer kept it brisk, 5 to 9,000 feet tonight. Incendiaries. No defensive guns to save weight. Someone muttered, translation, "We're naked," and the room laughed, tight and low. Wallace's pencil ticked faster. Low meant accurate. Low meant the weather couldn't scatter their bombs. Low meant Tokyo wouldn't know what hit it until the city was already burning. What Tokyo's fire chief didn't know was that the high-altitude war had just ended, and the firestorm he couldn't imagine was 20 minutes from ignition. A hand went up with a question about the altitude, but the officer cut him off. At that height, they would hit what they aimed at. Engines started as the sky lost its color. The island trembled with the vibration of roughly 100 cylinders finding rhythm. Wallace slid into his place, pulled on his headset, and tested the radio. Voices came through as letters and numbers, call signs lined up like beads on a string. He counted them. 21, 22, and on. Tokyo settled into still air at street level, no wind tugging at sleeves. The city had braced for the high, thin raids that came like distant thunder, bombs scattering wide because the wind up there never kept its promises. Hashimoto was grateful her husband was away. The bucket felt heavier with one arm, but the baby breathed against her. Across the alley, a neighbor tested a pump handle and nodded. The B-29 climbed, then leveled at a height that made Wallace's throat tighten. He could smell oil and hot metal and something sweet he couldn't place. The bombardier cracked a joke about the view. No one laughed. The pilot's voice was steady. Doors on the pip. "Radio check," Wallace said. The beads were all still there. He pressed the talk key. His first clue wasn't a sound, but a light that didn't act like light. White strands came down, each with a tail. For a half second, some people thought snow until the tails flicked and the strands turned into dozens of small bodies that punched through roofs and floors, right into the places where paper walls met timber. The rooms bloomed. "On the run," the pilot said. The bay doors opened, and the wind shoved itself into everything, into clothes and mouths and prayer. The plane changed shape around Wallace as the racks let go. The streamers chased their own shadows, and then the city began to answer. Heat rose. The aircraft bucked as if a sea had found it in the sky. Wallace smelled smoke at altitude, felt the wrongness of fire and flight talking to each other. The radio bloomed with short words. Off, on, trouble, turn. He kept counting beads, and nodded to himself when he heard each one again. On the street, the ember storm began, and Hashimoto ran. The baby slid almost to her elbow, and she hitched him higher, kept running. She reached the first footbridge, and the rail was already hot enough to bite. Behind her, a man shouted for his mother and for water in the same breath. The canal ahead threw back the color of the sky. She squeezed herself around the thickest of the crowd, felt her shoulder scrape wood. The baby made a small sound. That half cry that says, "I'm still a baby and this is too loud." By the second wave, the fires had become a language. A row of houses went at once as if a line had been drawn under them. Someone yelled, "To the big bridge!" and people believed him. Up there in the sky, a voice on the net broke off like a pencil snapped. Wallace froze. The pilot said they were getting tossed, and the flight engineer swore softly before apologizing. Down below, the embers found the water and rode it. Oil, varnish, roof pitch, everything burned again. The canal's surface skinned over and burned. People who had been told to go toward water stood there blinking at a river that made new fire in both directions. Some jumped in anyway. Through all this, Hashimoto turned away from the canal and into the wind shadow of a taller building, the baby's hair smelling like smoke and something sweet acrid. A woman grabbed her forearm and pulled hard, saying, "This way," a direction Hashimoto hadn't practiced, but she took it. 2 neighborhoods away, a young girl, 8 years old, Haruyo Nihei, followed adults into a shelter cut into the ground. The air inside tasted like damp wood and dust. Then the door pulsed. She could feel it through shoes and knees as more people piled in. The sound changed before the heat did. It got thin. Shouts turned into whispers. She fell and didn't hit dirt but someone soft. Then another body landed on her, and the world went warm and heavy. Back in the aircraft, Wallace said, "Radio check again." Most of the crew answered. The plane lurched as a column of heat tried to pick it up and put it back down in a different place. The bombardier's voice came back clipped. "Loads off." All off. The pilot didn't answer because he was flying the airplane. When the first fires reached the big market buildings, they stopped bothering with the shape of the street grid. Bridges glowed dull, red, and then bright. When the first one fell through the railing, he didn't scream but made a small sound and disappeared. Hashimoto saw a man carrying a bundle that turned out to be a girl the size of her own baby at birth, holding that bundle with one hand at the head and one under the hips, while sparks shook out of her hair. She tightened her grip and aimed for a street that ran parallel to the canal, a strip of dirt where something had been torn down months ago. Above, Wallace looked at the light coming off his instruments. It was brighter in here and darker out there. The flight engineer announced the temperature like a person reads a number off a list, careful and even. The pilot said, "We're out," not sounding relieved, but as if he had declared a state. They turned for home. The ocean accepted them with a flat sound. The rhythm broke. Wallace heard it before, he felt it, a metal tone turning sour. The inboard engine on one wing coughed hard. The prop spun faster than the world wanted it to, and it left the airplane. For one instant, it was a piece of bright death flying in a circle before it hit the outboard engine and ruined the rest of the wing's good intentions. The airplane was without two engines and nobody in it had anything to say. Wallace put his hand on the radio, picturing the vast gap between here and Iwo Jima, 700 miles of open ocean. The pilot's voice went quiet but stayed steady. "We'll make the turn," he said. "We'll keep her light." In Tokyo, the wind shifted and the fire found new streets to consume. Nihei lay buried beneath bodies, and someone above her stopped moving, becoming shelter. Hashimoto made it to a dirt strip where the flames lost interest, crouching behind a low wall to press the baby's face against her neck and shield him from the smoke. At dawn, the city's east side districts had become flat, featureless shapes with occasional bridge bones jutting through. People stood among the ruins and tried to reconstruct rooms using only memory. Hashimoto walked toward where her parents' lane should have been, navigating by a tree stump that resembled a fist, now blackened and opened. She found a neighbor sitting on a bucket, staring at the space where a door used to be rather than meeting her eyes. Far out over gray water, Wallace's damaged wing kept functioning. He worked the radio, read back headings, and kept his string of beads as tight as possible, though one bead never answered. Eventually an island rose where only water had been, and the pilot set his airplane down on its narrow strip as carefully as placing a book on a shelf. Two engines went silent while two men cried into their masks. Back in the city, Reiko Muto survived the night and found work she never chose. She tore cloth into strips for burned hands, discovering that some people looked like they were sleeping until she touched them and found they didn't move. Among the shallow breathers, she propped them up, pressed cups to their lips, moved them away from heat, and whispered names to keep track. This one is Tadao, this one is Aya, this one is me. By mid-morning, numbers began to circulate. Square miles reduced to ash, tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands homeless. Later, professional counters would argue about exact figures. A city had transformed into fuel and then into memory in a single night. Crews who flew low reported cockpit heat and empty seats at breakfast. Whatever doctrine had promised from miles above had been disproven by what any child understands. Keep throwing fire at paper and wood long enough, and the map redraws itself. Spring followed winter, bringing the same bombing profile extended toward other cities. Their people learned the same lessons. Some bridges fail you, water deceives, dirt offers friendship, neighbors save you or they don't. Years later, a boy named Katsumoto Saotome, who ran that night, became a man who built a place for memories, hanging tags beside objects, a child's shoe, a pump handle, a ladle burned down to half its size. On an anniversary, a woman named Shizuyo Takeuchi stood in a room and spoke aloud about how the people who lived through fire should be remembered just like those who survived other kinds of destruction. Muto stood beside her, along with survivors who had endured nights that were never supposed to happen. An ANM 69 incendiary falls with a streamer so it lands nose first and not like a confused seed. The nose punches through tile or thin wood, the casing opens, and a small charge throws burning gel across space like a dog shaking water everywhere. The gel sticks to anything, paper, wood, cloth, or hair, and it burns longer than you think and hotter than your plan. 40 clusters in a single bomber means about 1,500 bomblets. Multiply that across a formation of dozens of aircraft, then by wind that doesn't just carry flame but feeds it, and the firestorm grows exponentially. A woman named Hashimoto came to the mouth of a narrow lane and had to choose, toward the big bridge where most people ran, or the little strip of dirt where a house had been knocked down. The bridge went somewhere. The dirt didn't. She went for the dirt. The embers ran right over the broken ground and thinned. Her baby coughed and then quieted as she pressed his face into the triangle between her chin and collarbone. In a ward across the river, a girl named Nihei's world became soundless weight and a patch of air that reached her in small gifts. The men piled on top of her died. Because they died where they fell, her small chest had space to move. Later, she learned what had happened, though she never felt heroic about it, only small under other people's last decisions. On the ocean, a pilot named Wallace moved through radio checks and fuel checks and headings. He talked to Iwo only when he had to because every word was a little weight of power taken from the set. The engineer read cylinder head temperatures, like counting syllables. Occasionally, the pilot said a word that made the whole crew breathe again. Good, fine, hold. The radio net was thin now with too many beads gone and too much string showing. By dawn, Tokyo wasn't a map anymore. A woman named Reiko Muto moved through the ash with her sleeves rolled and a strip of cloth in her teeth because she needed both hands. Within minutes, she got good at choosing who to help and who to step past. She wrapped hands and filled cups as long as there were hands to wrap and cups to fill. The night kept its secrets. That's what a firestorm is. Weather that belongs to a city for one night only. The bridge sang before it failed. Hashimoto heard it, a low note moving through the boards and rail, a sound that lived in her bones more than in her ears. Heat had crept along the iron and made it expand, and that expansion had nowhere to go. People were packed, nose to neck, shoulders, finding strangers' ribs like furniture in a dark room. Someone in front stumbled, and the stumble moved backward as a push. Hashimoto turned sideways and flattened herself, protecting the baby with her torso the way animals do. On the far side, a man jumped into water that was burning on top and black underneath. For a heartbeat, he disappeared in the red skin, then came up through it with hair smoking and eyes wide, mouth opening like a fish pulled onto a dock. He took a breath that probably tasted like roofing tar and kept moving. Inside Nihei's shelter, the air began to leave. Fire outside ate oxygen the way a crowd eats space. As the temperature rose, the damp wood gave back steam that wasn't steam for long. People pressed toward the door because doors are spells. But the door was made of other people now, locked by the weight behind it. Things that look hard, beams, benches, a pair of shoes, became fuel. Nihei lost the sound of voices and found the sound of her own heart, loud at first and then soft. When she woke later, the world was rearranged around her. The bodies that had been on top were cooling. The daylight that found the doorway was a color she didn't know how to name. Up in Wallace's ship, the heat columns took their turn. A city that big makes its own wind when it burns, air rushing in at street level and up through the center like breath through a flute. That uprush hit the wings, and the pilot rode it like bad surf, while Wallace braced his knees and felt the fine quiver of metal telling him where the stress lines were. 2 engines failed. Wallace answered the radio with nothing but the essentials, while the pilot said they'd keep her light of guns, light of 2 engines, light of 1 city that had been erased under them. About 16 square miles lay flattened, not a metaphor, but neighborhood names that used to mean family and now mean the hollow noise your feet make when they walk where people used to talk. Nearly 100,000 bodies? 1 million homeless? A night with no door to close? Hashimoto reached the place where a lane should have opened between 2 rows of houses and found the wrong kind of space. Her parents weren't there, and her sister wasn't where a wall should have protected her. A neighbor told her about the way the wind had come and about the thing with the door. She looked down at the baby and saw a smear of ash on his forehead in the shape of a thumbprint. She left it there for a while. Maybe it was protection. Maybe it was a signature that said, "We were here." Wallace's wheels kissed the Ewo strip and then argued with it. Rubber shrieked. The airplane shuddered, a ripple through a sleeping animal. Then it was done. 2 engines cold, 2 engines hot enough to smell like a machine that had survived something and wasn't sure why. The ground crew came in at a run and then slowed when they saw the wing. They walked and said normal things. "How's your day, boys? Where are you from?" It helps people remember which world they live in. By noon, the island briefings had changed. The incendiary load moved forward, while the words that described altitude lost a 0. When institutions admit change, they simply hold a different meeting than the one they held yesterday. Wallace sat on a folding chair in a tent that smelled like canvas and old coffee. The debrief officer wrote with a pencil because pencils work when pens don't. He asked questions as if the answers didn't have blood under their fingernails. Wallace said the altitude number when asked, smiled and said, "The city was weather," when the officer inquired about unusual conditions. He wanted to ask about the call sign that had gone to static and stayed there, but he didn't. Everyone in the tent had their own bead missing from the string. Across a flat schoolyard in Tokyo, Muto looked down at 2 people who both needed water now. One was older and breathing in short wheezes, the other younger but with burns across both hands and one side of the face. 2 cups, 1 pair of hands. She propped the older one first because those breaths were closer to stopping, then turned to the younger and said something and lifted the cup again. Later, she would remember the feel of the cup more than the faces. In the weeks after Tokyo, crews heard the same instructions on different nights. People in other cities learned the same lessons: Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya. The profile was the same because the profile worked: low altitude, night missions, clustered fire, escape routes that accepted the night's wind. A map on a wall showed the line pressing on a bruise. What worked one night became standard practice, then repetition. Low altitude was different. At around 30,000 feet, the wind above Japan chewed at the path of a falling object. The bomb site designed for Europe couldn't keep a promise here. At 5,000 to 8,000 feet, the air stopped lying as much. The pattern tightened. Removing some of the heavy guns that eat range and payload meant carrying more of what matters. On this night, ending the fire as fast as possible and leaving before you ran out of sky kept crews alive. Range and payload became armor if you thought about them right. Saotomi was a boy when he ran with a crowd that had turned into one animal. He grew into a man who kept finding objects that had been turned into witnesses. A small burned ladle went on a shelf with a neat tag so a stranger could know where it had sat before the night and who had touched it after. Shoes, coins, fused together, a hinge that no longer hinges. These taught what a number in a report could not. At an anniversary microphone, Takeuchi stood and said, without raising her voice, that the people who had lived through this night should be recognized by the country that had fought the war around them and through them. Not honored for service they did not choose, but recognized for survival they did not want to be good at. She spoke plain, and the word that mattered most was still the simplest one: remember. The pilot who had said, "We'll keep her light," said it again on other nights. It stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like a procedure. Hashimoto counted family at last and found the count smaller. She pressed her nose to the baby's hair and let the smell of smoke in because you can't keep it out. Wallace wrote a letter home without the sentence he wanted to put in it. Muto tied 3 more strips and then finally sat down hard. Saotome hung 1 more tag. And in a place where numbers were gathered and meetings were held, a slide moved forward and stayed there. The city learned a new silence after that night. Not the good kind with tea in it, but the kind that stays in your clothes. Bridges cooled. Pumps squeaked. People sat on buckets because there were no chairs. On Iwo, men scraped rubber from a runway with sticks, their hands moving because stopping meant shaking. From the air that week, the east side wards showed their reversal. Streets looked like bones, fire breaks like scars. The canals that had promised safety became black veins in a burned hand. The doctrine that began the story put its hands in its pockets and left the room. A woman believed water would save her, while a man banked on height. The woman lived because she chose dirt over flame when the canal turned into a lie. Her survival differed from his. He and his crew kept the airplane light and level on 2 engines when the wing tried to fail them. That same night, both learned the map was wrong. They survived by redrawing it as they ran and flew. Years later, in a small museum room built by a survivor who had been a schoolboy, a tag hangs from a child's shoe. Someone wrote the name who had a right to write it. A visitor reads it and understands a number differently, not as a headline, but as a person. We kept her light. We went low. The city burned. The war changed because of nights like this one. Those who lived through it, some in the air, some in the streets, remember every detail so that the rest of us don't have to learn the same lesson from fire.